Well, OPEC delegates say the group is expected to keep oil output steady at its Sunday meeting, this despite tensions between Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the U.S. capture of Venezuelan President Maduro. The meeting involves 8 members: Saudi Arabia, Russia, the UAE, Kazakhstan, Kuwait, Iraq, Algeria and Oman, who together produce about half the world's oil. Oil prices fell more than 18% in 2025 amid concerns of oversupply. OPEC has historically managed internal disputes but now faces multiple crises: U.S. sanctions on Russian oil, unrest in Iran, and the sudden U.S. takeover of Venezuela, which has the world's largest oil reserves. Well, Isaac Khambule is a professor of political economy and director of the Africa Center for Evidence at the University of Johannesburg and joins us now. Prof, a very good afternoon to you. Let's perhaps start here. I mean, there are questions around just how the United States' control over Venezuela's oil infrastructure could influence global energy prices. I mean, help us understand then the status of Venezuela's oil reserves versus what it currently produces. And I think more importantly, the implications of what we heard from Trump promising to run Venezuela and make way for U.S. oil companies in the country.
Thank you so much, and good day to you, Unati, and all the SABC viewers. And I think you're asking very important questions. And if we consider some of the critical questions that you've posed, one is, what happens from now on? Does the U.S. take control of the Venezuelan oil, and how much oil? We do know that in terms of reserves, Venezuela has the largest oil reserve of all countries in the world. And that is definitely one of the key reasons that the U.S. was set up again in this idea of saying we want to take control of the Venezuelan oil because they are closer to Venezuela. So it will be easier for them to control that particular oil rather than having to go to the Middle East to try and stir problems in order to be able to control oil. So for now, it seems to be a new shift in the US's economy and in terms of business operandi that says, let's focus on oil that is closer to us. And we have seen again some of the threats that have been coming for months, and as well as even now, President Trump also indicating that the president of Colombia is also facing particular problems. But I think what we're seeing here is the U.S. basically indicating that they have a change in its foreign policy in terms of where to focus on oil. And then secondly, how do they then use this particular oil to dominate the oil industry? Because as we have seen, the likes of China, the likes of India have been heavily dependent on Russian oil. So now the U.S. is seeing it as a strategic position to influence the global oil prices. And again, in this particular case, it is likely to be at the advantage of the U.S. And we are likely to see a skyrocket in oil prices if the U.S. has its way. But from what we're currently seeing, that's the deputy president is likely to be the acting president in Venezuela. That is also likely to disrupt some of the plans that the U.S. has if the deputy president again sticks to national interest of Venezuela.
Yeah. And just let's go back to what we earlier talked about in terms of OPEC. I mean, Venezuela was one of the biggest global oil producers and was one of the main founders of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which is OPEC. But despite these political tensions between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and now, of course, the U.S. capture of the president of Venezuela, OPEC has agreed to maintain these steady oil prices. Just help us understand that dynamic in light of these recent developments and also what you're saying in terms of likely scenarios.
Well, the OPEC, as we know it, right now seems to be under the control of the U.S. because we know that your UAE and your Saudi Arabia, again, on the US's side, and they are busy deliberating on further deals and as well as investment. So as we see, it shows us that OPEC is likely to follow the posture that has been taken by the US, and they will not again limit any oil production. But I think one of the key things that we must also note is, in as much as Venezuela was producing some of the highest barrels in the world, but then they were facing sanctions, they were facing issues of underinvestment. So they had restricted their oil supply to certain countries that seems to be friendly to Venezuela, such as China, such as India and other countries. But given the status quo, it shows us that Venezuela does not have any allies at this current moment because OPEC is not going to support Venezuela. And it is likely to be the case that Venezuela will be on a free fall and US companies are likely to go and try to privatize some of the oil in Venezuela if we do not see a bloodbath in the streets of Venezuelan citizens rising up and saying they want to defend their resources.
I think you mentioned it earlier on in terms of just how difficult it might be given the current political instability. Given, that Venezuela's Vice President, Delcy Rodriguez, announced a state of emergency, how easy or difficult will it be for Trump's administration then to what they call jumpstart the industry?
I think it will be quite difficult because if we take things for what is currently happening at the moment, we know there's likely to be some sort of continuity. And again, we know for a fact that the US does not want to see any bloodbath in the street. So what they're likely going to try is to stir up trouble and ensure that the current acting president does not have the popular support so that there could be major uprisings. And that is the only way they will be able to penetrate the Venezuelan oil. But again, we know that the oligarchs in Venezuela and those who are close to the state, who have the power, will try their best to ensure that they use whatever means to keep control of this particular oil. And I think that seems to be where the much of the final battle is going to be, because for now the US may think that they have struck gold, but it's likely to be that people will push from the bottom, because we know this is the first time in more than a decade where we are seeing a coup happen in everyday lives where it is broadcast, and it is likely to be the case that, as we know throughout the history of Latin America, that they tend to fight against the imperialism of the US.
All right, Prof, thank you so much for your analysis. Really do appreciate it. That is Professor Isaac Khambule, a Professor of Political Economy and Director of the Africa Center for Evidence at the University of Johannesburg.